The year is 793. On a cold June morning, the monks of Lindisfarne Monastery went about their daily rituals, prayers echoing through stone corridors, as they had for generations. They had no reason to suspect that this day would mark the beginning of an age that would reshape Europe. Then the ships appeared on the horizon, sleek, dragon-prowed vessels cutting through North Sea waters with terrifying speed. What followed became the spark that ignited the Viking Age. But the true story of these Norse seafarers extends far beyond the raid that made them infamous. The Vikings didn't emerge from nowhere. Their roots stretch back into the mists of Scandinavian prehistory, to communities shaped by ice, isolation, and the relentless demands of northern survival. Long before dragon ships terrorized Christian shores, the peoples of what would become Denmark, Norway, and Sweden had been developing the skills, technologies, and social structures that would make their descendants the most feared and admired seafarers of medieval Europe. Archaeological evidence places the earliest inhabitants of Scandinavia between 8,000 and 10,000 BC. Mobile hunter-gatherers who followed retreating glaciers northward as the Ice Age released its grip on the land. The massive ice sheets, in places more than 2 kilometers thick, had carved the dramatic fjords and valleys that would define Norwegian geography, creating natural fortresses and waterways that shaped how communities developed. Denmark's relatively flat terrain allowed for different settlement patterns, with coastal communities exploiting rich fishing grounds and developing maritime skills centuries before the Viking Age proper began. By the Bronze Age, between 1700 and 500 BC, complex social hierarchies had emerged across Scandinavia. Elaborate burial mounds scattered across the Swedish landscape contained intricate metalwork and imported materials from distant regions, revealing trade networks that stretched far beyond Scandinavian shores. These weren't isolated barbarians. They were participants in broader European exchange systems, absorbing influences and innovations while developing distinctly Nordic cultural practices. The Proto-Norse language evolved from earlier Germanic roots, eventually giving rise to Old Norse, the tongue that would carry Viking sagas across oceans and centuries. Viking society rested on a rigid, 3-tiered structure that determined everything from daily work to legal rights. At the bottom labored the thralls, slaves who might comprise up to a quarter of the population. Unlike classical slavery, Norse thraldom often resulted from capture during raids or economic desperation, and these unfree people performed the brutal labor that sustained farms, built fortifications, and constructed the longships that would carry their owners to glory and wealth. Archaeological evidence reveals thralls were treated as property, buried without the weapons and goods that accompanied free people to the afterlife. The middle tier consisted of carls, free farmers, craftsmen, and traders who formed the backbone of Norse society. These were the people who worked their own land, attended thing assemblies where local disputes were settled and laws debated, and who could be called upon for military service. A carl might own his farm or rent it from a more powerful figure, but crucially, he possessed legal rights and could seek justice for wrongs done to him. This wasn't egalitarian in the modern sense. Wealth disparities existed among carls, but it created a society where merit and fortune could elevate one's status. At the apex stood the jarls, aristocratic warriors whose wealth came from land ownership, successful raiding, and control of trade networks. These were the men who could afford complete military equipment: helmet, mail shirt, sword, and shield. Though recent research suggests swords served more as status symbols than practical battlefield weapons, they were too valuable and perhaps too fragile for the brutal hack and slash of actual combat, where spears and axes dominated. Jarls commanded the loyalty of carls and owned thralls, using their resources to equip raiding parties and trading expeditions that would enhance their prestige and wealth. What transformed these Scandinavian societies from regional powers into the scourge and wonder of Europe wasn't superior numbers or exceptional brutality. It was technology. The Viking longship represents one of history's most elegant solutions to a complex engineering problem. These vessels needed to cross open ocean, navigate shallow rivers, carry substantial cargo, and beach on any shore without harbor facilities. The solution combined clinker-built hulls, overlapping planks that provided flexibility in rough seas, with shallow drafts allowing navigation up rivers impassable to deeper vessels. The critical innovation wasn't the ship itself, but the sail. Scholarly debate has raged for decades about when Scandinavian shipbuilders adopted sail technology. Some argue for adoption long before the Viking Age, while the generally accepted timeline places it in the mid to late 8th century. The Salme ship burials in Estonia, dated to around 750 AD, provide the earliest archaeological evidence of combined rowing and sailing vessels used by Scandinavians. For Norway specifically, the Oseberg ship, constructed in 820 AD, offers the first definitive proof, though it certainly wasn't the first Norwegian sailing vessel. This technological leap changed everything. Suddenly, ambitious Norsemen could reach destinations that had been theoretical, crossing the North Atlantic to Iceland, navigating river systems deep into Eastern Europe, striking at coastal settlements, and retreating before defenders could organize. The sail didn't just enable Viking expansion. It fundamentally altered the calculus of risk and reward that governed Norse decision-making about where to seek fortune. The Lindisfarne raid didn't inaugurate Viking activity. It merely announced it to horrified Christian chroniclers whose accounts would shape perception for centuries. Recent scholarship suggests Viking raids began earlier, perhaps as early as 700 to 750 AD, with Lindisfarne representing not the first attack, but the first sufficiently documented and symbolically significant to warrant extensive written record. After all, previous small-scale raids wouldn't necessarily have attracted the attention of distant scribes, but the destruction of a prominent monastery, a center of learning and spiritual authority, demanded explanation and condemnation. Why did Vikings raid? The simple answer, wealth, contains truth but obscures complexity. Scandinavia, particularly Norway and Sweden, faced serious limitations. Mountainous terrain and harsh climates restricted agricultural productivity. Growing populations strained available resources. Political fragmentation meant ambitious men had limited opportunities to gain status within existing hierarchies. Raiding offered multiple solutions: movable wealth that could be converted into land and status, glory that enhanced reputation and attracted followers, and opportunities for younger sons who wouldn't inherit family holdings. But characterizing Vikings purely as raiders fundamentally misrepresents their impact and activity. Recent DNA analysis of over 400 individuals from Viking Age burial sites across Europe and Greenland has revolutionized understanding of who Vikings actually were. The results proved startling. Viking identity wasn't limited to Scandinavian genetic ancestry. Skeletons from famous Viking burial sites in Scotland were genetically local people, Picts, who had adopted Viking cultural practices and were buried with full Norse honors. These weren't conquered peoples forced into foreign customs. They were individuals who became Vikings through cultural adoption rather than ancestral connection. This finding challenges the entire concept of Vikings as a unified ethnic group. Instead, Viking identity functioned more like a profession or cultural practice that individuals from diverse backgrounds could adopt. A Pictish warrior might take up the Viking lifestyle, participate in raids and trade expeditions, and be honored with a boat burial complete with weapons and Norse grave goods, all without possessing Scandinavian ancestry. This wasn't unusual or exceptional. The DNA evidence suggests it happened frequently across the Viking world. The study also revealed Vikings were far more diverse in appearance than popular imagination suggests. The stereotypical blonde-haired, blue-eyed Norsemen, largely fictional, ancient Viking populations had, on average, darker hair and eyes than modern Danes. Many Vikings possessed brown hair, and genetic ancestry showed influences from Asia and southern Europe that predated the Viking Age. The movement and mixture of peoples across medieval Europe created far more genetic diversity than romantic nationalisms would later acknowledge. One of the study's most fascinating discoveries came from a boat burial in Estonia. 4 brothers who died the same day, buried together with companions who shared genetic similarities, suggesting they all came from the same small Swedish town or village. This reveals the intimate, familial nature of some Viking expeditions. These weren't always massive armies of strangers united by plunderlust. They were kinship groups, brothers and cousins and neighbors who sailed together, fought together, and sometimes died together far from home. Viking expansion followed multiple vectors, creating a network of settlements and influence that stretched from North America to Central Asia. The commonly understood pattern, Norwegians west, Danes south, Swedes east, contains truth but oversimplifies reality. Vikings from all regions participated in various expeditions to different degrees, and the destinations that became permanent settlements often attracted colonists from across Scandinavia. In the British Isles, Scandinavian invasions began in earnest around 865, when a force led by the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, Halfdan, Ivar the Boneless, and possibly Ubi, conquered the ancient kingdoms of East Anglia and Northumbria, reducing Mercia to a fraction of its former size. Only Wessex under Alfred the Great managed to resist, establishing a truce around 878 that became the foundation of a treaty recognizing much of England under Danish control. The Dane Law. This wasn't temporary occupation, but permanent settlement, with Norse families farming land, establishing legal systems, and gradually intermingling with Anglo-Saxon populations. The linguistic evidence of this settlement remains visible today. English contains hundreds of words borrowed from Old Norse, and certain grammatical simplifications in English may result from the need for Norse and Anglo-Saxon speakers to communicate. Place names across northern and eastern England reveal Scandinavian settlement patterns. Anywhere with names ending in by, Thorpe, or Thwaite marks locations where Vikings established communities that persisted through centuries of subsequent cultural change. Ireland experienced similar patterns. Raids began in 795, but by the 9th century, Scandinavians had established kingdoms at Dublin, Limerick, and Waterford. These weren't merely military camps but functioning urban centers that became crucial nodes in Viking trade networks. Dublin, in particular, developed into a major slave trading hub, where captives taken in raids could be sold to merchants who would transport them to markets across the Viking world and beyond. The likelihood that Ireland would be unified under Scandinavian leadership ended decisively at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. But Norse influence persisted in Irish culture, language, and genetics. The most dramatic Viking expansion pushed westward across the North Atlantic to lands no Europeans had previously settled. Iceland's colonization began around 900 AD, attracting settlers not just from Norway, but from Norse communities in Ireland and Scotland, who brought Celtic slaves and wives, creating a genetic mix still visible in modern Icelandic populations. The Icelandic settlers established the Althing, one of the world's oldest surviving parliaments, where free men gathered annually to settle disputes and make laws in a remarkable experiment in republican governance. From Iceland, Eric the Red pushed farther west to Greenland, around 985 AD. Despite the optimistic name, likely a marketing ploy to attract settlers, Greenland's harsh conditions supported only marginal farming communities that relied heavily on walrus ivory trade with Europe. Isotopic analysis of walrus ivory, found across the Viking diaspora, suggests this trade may have been Greenland's primary economic activity, the thread connecting these remote settlements to the broader medieval economy. These Norse Greenland communities persisted until the 15th century, their disappearance possibly linked to climate change during the Little Ice Age that made already marginal farming impossible. The most audacious Western expedition reached North America. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson led an expedition that established a settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows on Newfoundland's northern tip. Archaeological evidence confirms Norse presence. The remains of sod houses, iron nails, and artifacts unmistakably Scandinavian. The sagas speak of Vinland, a land where grapes grew wild, suggesting Norse explorers ventured farther south into regions with warmer climates. But, unlike Iceland and Greenland, this American foothold proved unsustainable. Conflict with indigenous peoples and the sheer distance from Scandinavian support networks likely doomed the settlement, though Norse voyages to North America for timber may have continued sporadically for decades. Eastern expansion followed entirely different patterns, utilizing river systems to penetrate deep into what would become Russia and Ukraine. Swedish Vikings, known in the East as Rus or Varangians, established settlements along river routes that connected the Baltic with the Byzantine Empire and Islamic caliphates. This wasn't primarily about raiding. It was systematic exploitation of geography for trade. The Volga and Dnieper rivers became highways of commerce, with Vikings portaging their ships over obstacles to reach markets offering unimaginable wealth. From Aldigjuborg on Lake Ladoga, traders could navigate the Volkhov River to Novgorod, then, via the Lovet River, and a 3-kilometer portage reach the Volga headwaters. Following the Volga south brought them to Volga, Bulgaria, and eventually to the Caspian Sea, opening access to Khwarezm, Samanid slave markets in Central Asia, and ultimately, Iran and the Abbasid Caliphate. The Dnieper route offered similar possibilities, running from the Baltic to the Black Sea and Constantinople. This journey wasn't easy. 7 major rapids required ships to be hauled overland, a perilous undertaking that left traders vulnerable to attack, but the rewards justified the risks. At Constantinople, capital of the Byzantine Empire and one of the world's wealthiest cities, Norse merchants found eager markets for furs, amber, and slaves, while bringing back silver, silk, and exotic goods that commanded premium prices back in Scandinavia. The scale of this eastern trade defies easy comprehension. In Sweden alone, archaeologists have discovered over 80,000 silver dirhams, Islamic coins, with the vast majority dating to the 9th and 10th centuries. These weren't scattered finds but massive hoards, sometimes containing thousands of coins buried together. The Vikings weren't interested in coins as currency in the modern sense. They valued silver by weight, often cutting coins into pieces called hack silver that could be weighed and used in transactions. This weight-based bullion economy allowed Vikings to trade with peoples using different monetary systems, converting between coins, ingots, and cut pieces as circumstances demanded. The trade goods moving along these routes reveal the interconnectedness of the medieval world. From Scandinavia flowed furs, sable, marten, and fox from northern forests, amber from Baltic shores, walrus ivory from Arctic hunts, iron weapons, and slaves. The slave trade proved particularly lucrative and morally horrifying. Vikings captured people during raids across Eastern Europe, transporting them to markets where they were sold to Muslim merchants for silver and silk. European slaves, termed sakaliba in Arabic sources, were highly valued in Middle Eastern markets. Archaeological evidence suggests raids specifically targeted young people, maximizing the human harvest for this brutal commerce. Returning north came silver in massive quantities, silk from China and Byzantium that became prestige items for Scandinavian elites, spices like cinnamon, pepper, and saffron that demonstrated wealth and sophistication, precious stones including garnets and rock crystals, and fine textiles that transformed how wealthy Vikings dressed and displayed status. Items found in Viking graves and settlements read like a catalog of global trade. A silk cap, a counterfeit coin from Samarkand, a cowrie shell from the Red Sea or Persian Gulf, all buried in York, revealing the extent of Scandinavian commercial reach. This eastern trade created permanent settlements and political structures. The Rus established themselves at Novgorod around 862 and Kiev around 900, gradually blending Scandinavian and Slavic cultures into what would become the Kievan Rus state. By the 11th century, these communities had become so thoroughly Slavicized that calling them Scandinavian no longer made sense, though Old East Norse may have been spoken in some areas as late as the 13th century. The Varangian Guard, elite Byzantine troops recruited primarily from Scandinavians, offered military service opportunities that attracted Norse warriors well into the 11th century. Swedish law from Västergötland declared that no one could inherit while staying in Greece, the Scandinavian term for the Byzantine Empire, attempting to stem emigration as young men sought fortune in Constantinople's service. But Vikings weren't just warriors and merchants. Their activities required sophisticated support networks that recent scholarship reveals included women in crucial economic roles. Burial sites containing weights, scales, and imported goods suggest women managed farms and local trade, while men traveled, serving as economic agents who sustained trade networks and distributed wealth. Some women traveled as merchants themselves, challenging assumptions about gender roles in Viking society that derived more from later medieval European norms than actual Norse practice. The religious world that shaped Viking consciousness bears little resemblance to the organized doctrines of Christianity or Islam they encountered. Norse paganism wasn't a religion in the modern sense. It was a fully integrated worldview where spiritual and practical concerns merged seamlessly. The gods weren't distant abstractions but active participants in the cosmos, beings whose favor might mean the difference between successful harvest and starvation, victory and defeat, honor and humiliation. The Norse pantheon divided into two main groups, the Aesir and the Vanir, who according to mythology had fought a war before establishing peace through hostage exchange. Scholars debate whether this myth preserves memories of actual conflicts between different Scandinavian belief systems that eventually merged. At the pantheon's head stood Odin, the All-Father, god of wisdom, poetry, and war, who had sacrificed an eye for knowledge and hung 9 days on the world tree Yggdrasil to discover the runes. His wife Frigg presided over marriage and motherhood, while their son Thor, god of thunder who wielded the hammer Mjolnir, protected Midgard, the world of humans, from giants and chaos. Other gods held specific domains. Tyr governed war and justice, Loki embodied fire and trickery, Frey and Freya represented fertility and prosperity, Njord controlled the sea, Bragi inspired poetry, and Hel ruled the underworld. Different regions favored different deities. Odin dominated in Sweden and Denmark. Thor commanded worship across all 3 countries except around Trondheim in Norway. Tyr found particular devotion in Denmark, and Frey in Sweden. This regional variation suggests Norse religion allowed considerable local adaptation rather than imposing uniform practice. Religious observance centered on sacrifice, blot, where animals and possibly humans were offered to gain divine favor. Recent archaeological discoveries at magnates' residences reveal large-scale religious sacrifices, suggesting wealthy individuals hosted elaborate ceremonies that reinforced their social position while honoring the gods. The famous temple at Uppsala in Sweden, described by Adam of Bremen in the 11th century, allegedly housed images of Thor, Odin, and Frey, with human and animal sacrifices performed during festivals. Whether these accounts accurately represent Norse practice or reflect Christian horror at pagan customs remains debated, but they indicate ritual practice centered on reciprocity, offerings given to gods in exchange for protection and prosperity. Christianity's arrival in Scandinavia began earlier than the Viking Age's official start. By 800 AD, parts of the population had already converted, and the first churches were appearing. Missionaries like Ansgar reached Denmark in the 8th and 9th centuries, encountering mixed reception. Vikings abroad encountered Christianity constantly, raiding monasteries, trading with Christian merchants, serving Christian kings. They saw that Christian countries were large, wealthy, and powerful, with impressive stone churches filled with treasures. Many merchants accepted baptism abroad because Christian trading partners wouldn't deal with pagans, making conversion a business necessity. What followed wasn't sudden replacement but centuries-long syncretism, where old and new beliefs coexisted and merged. Archaeological evidence reveals this transition vividly. A soapstone mold from Trend in Himmerland could cast both Christian crosses and Thor's hammers, allowing craftsmen to serve customers of either faith. Several Thor's hammers feature cross ornamentation, blending symbols in ways that would horrify both pagan and Christian purists, but made perfect sense to people navigating changing spiritual landscapes. A medieval font from Gettrup displays both crosses and hammers, suggesting even consecrated Christian objects incorporated Norse symbolism. One remarkable story captures the pragmatic approach many Vikings took toward baptism. A Viking representative at the Frankish court was baptized, receiving fine white cloth as a gift, a standard practice that made conversion materially attractive. This man, having been baptized 20 times by various Christian authorities, protested when presented with poor, coarse cloth At his 21st baptism, he'd come to expect quality white clothing for the ritual. The story, possibly apocryphal, reveals how some Vikings viewed baptism as a transaction or political gesture, rather than spiritual transformation. Formal conversion of Scandinavian kingdoms occurred primarily in the 10th and 11th centuries. Harald Bluetooth of Denmark adopted Christianity around 965 AD. Allegedly, after witnessing a Christian priest hold hot iron without injury, though political advantages of alliance with Christian Europe likely mattered more than miracles. His famous declaration, inscribed on the Jelling stone, that he had made the Danes Christian, represented aspiration more than reality. Many Danes continued worshipping Norse gods in secret or alongside Christian practice for generations. Norway's Christianization proved more contentious. Olaf Tryggvason, and later Olaf II Haraldsson, pursued aggressive conversion campaigns, destroying pagan temples and forcing baptism on resistant populations. This wasn't peaceful persuasion, but royal imposition backed by violence, generating conflicts that divided Norway for nearly a century. Sweden converted more gradually, with Christianity not firmly established until the 12th century. Iceland's conversion in 1000 AD occurred through democratic process. The Althing voted to adopt Christianity while allowing private pagan worship, a compromise that prevented civil war while acknowledging Christianity's growing influence. Why did Vikings ultimately convert? Religious convictions certainly motivated some individuals, but broader factors proved more decisive. Christianity offered access to European trade networks and diplomatic recognition. Christian kingdoms were reluctant to make treaties with pagans, and Christian merchants preferred dealing with fellow believers. The new religion provided ideological justification for royal authority, with church officials sanctifying kings as God's representatives rather than merely successful warriors. Christianity brought literacy and administrative capabilities through churchmen who could manage complex governmental functions. The shift from raiding to settled governance required different legitimizing frameworks than warrior prowess alone could provide. Yet, the old gods never completely vanished. Days of the week preserved their names: Thursday for Thor, Friday for Frigg or Freya. Folk beliefs about trolls, elves, and land spirits continued in rural areas, sometimes reinterpreted as Christian supernatural beings, but retaining distinctly Norse characteristics. Modern revivals of Norse paganism, a satro or fornsider, attempt to reconstruct pre-Christian practices, though the limited written sources mean modern believers engage more in creative reimagining than direct continuation of Viking religion. The Viking Age didn't end with a decisive battle or date, though 1066 serves as convenient marker. That year saw Harald Hardrada of Norway invade England, only to fall at Stamford Bridge, his death traditionally marking the end of the Viking era. But this event merely symbolized transformations already underway, processes that had been gradually eroding the conditions that made Viking raiding profitable and Viking expansion possible. Political consolidation fundamentally altered Scandinavian society. By the 10th century, centralized kingdoms were emerging in Denmark, under rulers like Harald Bluetooth and Sweyn Forkbeard, in Norway through Harald Fairhair's unification campaigns, and more gradually in Sweden. These kings didn't tolerate independent warrior bands forming for raids without royal permission. They wanted to control military force, gathering relatively large armies under central command, rather than allowing traditional voluntary associations of fighting men. This shift from decentralized warrior culture to centralized royal authority made raiding more difficult to organize and less socially acceptable. The targets of Viking raids grew stronger. European kingdoms that had been devastated in the 9th century learned to defend themselves. Fortifications improved, standing armies developed, and coastal defenses made opportunistic raids far riskier. The establishment of Normandy in 911, when Charles the Simple granted land to Rollo's Vikings in exchange for defense against other Vikings, exemplified a pattern where Norse settlers were absorbed into European political structures, becoming defenders rather than raiders. Within generations, Normans had adopted French language and customs, though their Viking heritage would manifest dramatically when William the Conqueror invaded England in 1066. Economic transformations reduced raiding's attractiveness. the massive influx of Islamic silver that had fueled the eastern trade routes dried up by the mid-11th century as the Abbasid Caliphate's silver production declined. The flow of English silver similarly ended. These losses forced adjustment toward more sustainable economic practices. Agriculture, local trade, exploitation of natural resources like timber and fish, trade increasingly replaced raiding as the primary means of acquiring wealth, with former Viking trading posts developing into proper towns functioning as secular and ecclesiastical administrative centers. Christianity's spread didn't just change religious practice, it transformed social values and international relationships. The Christian ethos discouraged raiding fellow Christians, narrowing acceptable targets. Church officials promoted peace and cooperation among Christian kingdoms, making the kind of aggressive expansion that characterized early Viking Age increasingly difficult to justify or execute. Kings seeking recognition from Christian Europe needed to demonstrate civilized governance rather than warrior prowess, shifting prestige markers from successful raids to effective administration and pious foundation of churches and monasteries. Internal conflicts also weakened Scandinavian military capacity. Rather than uniting for foreign adventures, Viking chieftains increasingly fought each other for control of consolidating kingdoms. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden experienced numerous civil wars and succession disputes that consumed military resources and attention. When Canute the Great briefly united England, Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden in the early 11th century, his empire represented not Viking expansion, but royal consolidation that would have been impossible in the fragmented 9th century. His death in 1035 saw this personal union fragment, with various contenders fighting for thrones rather than organizing raids. Environmental factors may have contributed to changing patterns. The medieval warm period that had facilitated Norse settlement of Greenland began giving way to cooling temperatures. Greenland's marginal farms became increasingly untenable, and the settlements there eventually disappeared by the 15th century. While climate change didn't directly end the Viking Age in Scandinavia, it may have contributed to reduced agricultural surpluses that had supported population growth and enabled younger sons to seek fortune abroad. By the late 11th century, Scandinavian rulers were directing military ambitions toward new objectives. Sigurd I of Norway sailed to the eastern Mediterranean in 1107 with Norwegian crusaders to fight for the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Danish and Swedish kings participated actively in Baltic crusades during the 12th and 13th centuries, seeking to expand Christian territory rather than pagan raiding grounds. This shift from raiding to crusading represented complete transformation. Former scourges of Christendom now fighting as Christian warriors against pagans and Muslims. The legacy Vikings left extends far beyond the 3 centuries of their most intense activity. Genetically, their impact remains visible across Europe. Modern populations in Iceland, the Faroe Islands, northern Scotland, Ireland, and northern England show significant Scandinavian ancestry. Interestingly, only 15 to 30% of modern Swedes share ancestry with Viking Age individuals who lived in the same region 13 centuries ago, suggesting enormous population movement and mixing in the centuries following the Viking era. Linguistically, Norse influence shaped English profoundly. Beyond obvious borrowings, the simplification of English grammar, loss of gendered nouns, simplified verb conjugations may result from the need for Old Norse and Old English speakers to communicate in Danelaw territories. Place names across northern Europe mark Norse settlement. Anywhere you find by, Thorpe, Ness, or Vik marks a location where Vikings established permanent presence. Culturally, the Viking Age left a complex legacy. The sagas preserved in Iceland, Heimskringla, the Poetic Edda, the sagas of Icelanders, represent one of medieval Europe's most remarkable literary traditions. These works, written down in the 13th century, but preserving earlier oral traditions, provide insight into Viking values, beliefs, and historical consciousness. They celebrate courage, honor, cunning, and loyalty, while acknowledging the tragic costs of violence and the inexorable working of fate. Modern understanding of Vikings has evolved dramatically. Recent archaeological work, DNA analysis, and careful historical scholarship have revealed a far more complex picture than either romantic 19th-century nationalism or simple condemnation as brutal raiders allowed. Vikings were simultaneously merchants and warriors, explorers and settlers, pagans and Christians, Scandinavians and adopted locals. They established trade networks spanning continents, explored unknown oceans, built sophisticated ships, developed republican governance in Iceland, served as elite guards in Constantinople, founded kingdoms in England and Russia, and reached North America 5 centuries before Columbus. Their story wasn't a simple rise and fall, but a gradual transformation as raiding chieftains became Christian kings, as Viking settlements became integral parts of European kingdoms, as Norse identity merged with and shaped the cultures they encountered. The Vikings didn't disappear. They evolved, leaving descendants and influences that shaped medieval and modern Europe in ways still visible today. If you found this deep journey through Viking history fascinating, make sure to like this video and subscribe to History Scrolls for more detailed explorations of ancient civilizations and legendary peoples. The Vikings may have sailed into history over 9 centuries ago, but their story continues to captivate and challenge our understanding of the medieval world. From Scandinavian fjords to North American shores, from Baghdad's markets to Iceland's Thing, the Norse seafarers left an indelible mark on human history, one that scholars are still uncovering and understanding in our own time.